Come on, I've got to be getting close to the solution. Carry the 1, move that over there, divide it by... Wait. No, that's it! I've got it! Finally. And the answer it all comes down to is... No, that can't be right. I must have made a mistake. This...
Impressive work for a deficient singularity. Naively seeking answers to questions its primitive mind can scarcely comprehend.
Get out of my head. I know what you are.
The same could be said for every creature of creation. In the deepest recesses of their being, I am the whole at the center of all things. The first scion of Morningstar. The revelation beast that consumes mind and soul alike. When you cry out in your dreams, it is Darkseid that you see.
Hello, I'm Tyler, this is the Imaginary Axis, and guys, I get it. The term God is totally overused these days, especially when it comes to villains. I mean, it can reference aliens, ghosts, science experiments, power levels, kind of impressive magic users. It really doesn't matter. Just because you can do a few things the average guy can't, I'm supposed to treat you like a deity? Ass. And without a standard classification, gods get their butts kicked all the time. It's a pretty far cry from the majesty, horror, and wonder of explaining away a reality-changing phenomenon that you can't comprehend or control, but it's also at least part of the reason that some people are convinced Darkseid, resident big bad of the DC universe, might just be a lot of talk. I mean, have you ever listened to one of his speeches? Darkseid is the new god. Darkseid is might above all. Darkseid is the Tiger Force at the core of all things. Darkseid is getting his teeth kicked in by Superman for the 11th time in a row. Please. Every would-be conqueror sings from the same hymn sheet. Just calling yourself a god isn't enough to make you an actual threat. At least, that's what I thought. But after years of reading DC Comics and nearly half a century of this power-mad cosmic menace challenging the Justice League, I started to notice some interesting details about the nature of Darkseid's existence. A collection of out-of-place quirks that, by themselves, could probably be dismissed as a few eccentric writers, executive mismanagement, the natural inconsistency of comics. But together, they began to form a pattern. A pattern that, when followed, led me down a rabbit hole so deep, I kid you not, I have never seen anything like it in all of comics. A closer look at Darkseid starts to reveal a labyrinth of unsolved mysteries. Arguments about avatars and true forms that consume online fan sites. Writer interviews, characters vaguely implying there's more to him than meets the eye. Strange facts about his history that seem to appear and disappear at random. And a single undeniable truth about the root cause of every conflict that's ever plagued the DC universe. If I'm right about what I found, then that dark cloud of mystery looming just out of focus beyond Darkseid contains a secret so mind-wrenchingly drunk on evil and power that it redefines the modern idea of a god. And I'm not exaggerating. So, what do I mean? Well, if you were to just read comics, casually, at random, or to follow your favorite stories, there's a pretty good chance you'd never see anything off about Darkseid. He's the tyrannical dictator of a dystopian nightmare world called Apokolips. Constantly in search of power, he often finds himself in conflict with the neighboring planet New Genesis. He exchanged sons with their leader at one point as a kind of customary peace offering, since both armies and their commanders are roughly equivalent in power. But the problem is that everybody recognizes this treaty is just a formality. The moment Darkseid finds a power source that can tip the scales, he'll tip them, and then the rest of the universe shortly after. Enter the anti-life equation, some sort of vaguely understood formula that, once completed, can force people into subjugation under Darkseid. For mysterious reasons unknown to even him, key portions of the equation keep cropping up on Earth. So, Darkseid developed a habit of invading the planet, the Justice League developed a habit of stopping him, and you've got comics. Aliens, heroes, universal genocide, and math. It's honestly a pretty standard setup. There's a whole backstory about how Darkseid and his species rose to power after the old gods died, making them the new gods. But like I mentioned before, the word god is kind of overplayed these days. You're totally justified in only seeing him as a really powerful alien with typical supervillain delusions of grandeur, but he's not. And viewing him like that does a major disservice to the secret lore hidden beneath Darkseid's story. Lore that I'm willing to bet will surprise and fascinate you, even if you think you already know what I'm going to talk about. But in order to understand all that, first we have to take a trip back to when everything began. The 1970s. It was a good decade. The first home video game released, Disney World became a thing, the US president was not a crook or something like that, and comic book legend Jack the King Kirby left Marvel Comics to work for DC. For those of you unfamiliar with the name, this was a really big deal at the time. Jack Kirby was and is one of the biggest names in all of comic books. World-renowned co-creator of the Marvel Universe, artist and plotter to Stan Lee's writing and editing. So his presence at DC was a game changer, and as you might have guessed, Darkseid was his next big idea. Jack wanted to create a group of DC characters with cosmic significance, a type of modern-day myth blending religion and mysticism with science fiction, modern culture, and advanced technology. Looking at some of his earliest work with the characters, we can actually see the scattered pieces of a few storylines he never got a chance to finish. For example, according to a divine prophecy, the conflict between Apocalypse and New Genesis was supposed to finally end in a brutal fight to the death between Darkseid and his son Orion. Remember the one he traded to his arch-nemesis in a momentary bid for peace? Yeah, smart move there, big guy. The anti-life equation was constantly teased, but relatively little concrete information was ever given about it. The new gods were also specifically located outside the multiverse, set aside from DC's usual adventures in a realm beyond time and space for only Jack to work on. And their planets were so massive in size that later authors would go on to claim they dwarfed galaxies. If you were to take the Earth and drop it into New Genesis, it would barely displace the waters of a small lake. But perhaps the most important plot point to take note of is exactly how powerful Jack intended these characters to be. Like, take this guy for example, Magnar. Relatively inconsequential, only appears in 4 stories as far as I can tell. One was a reprint and he was dead in the other 2, but he can casually punch with the combined force of 100 galaxies flying at your face. This sort of thing was standard fare for the new gods. They were real larger-than-life characters. It might be common enough for alien races to be depicted as stronger, faster, and smarter than the average human, but these guys took it to the next level. And Darkseid towered above nearly every single one of them. Fast enough to surprise Superman, having the edge up in combat and occasionally moving with so much speed that Clark couldn't even see him. Remember, these aren't ordinary eyes we're talking about. Darkseid can cross the entire universe in seconds at worst. He moves, fights, and reacts all at about the same speed when he needs to, and he can think even faster. Darkseid is a super genius, master strategist, inventor, and battle tactician. With millennia of experience in war and combat training, it's difficult to find a defeat of his that didn't turn out to be part of his plan. He's outsmarted DC's finest on more than a few occasions. He's unlocked the secrets of mind, matter, and soul, built machines that toy with celestial bodies like pawns. Later stories would depict Darkseid trying to enter the Source in a bid for ultimate power. If you've never heard of the Source before, it's basically this infinite sea of energy that transcends all things and spun every reality into being. Since the beginning of time, nothing has been able to find a way around the pan-dimensional barrier that guards it at the edge of existence unless they were a hair short of omnipotent or the Source wanted them inside. Except for Darkseid. But of course, most notably of all, Jack Kirby's original version of Darkseid could go toe-to-toe with Superman and win. Sometimes. This was back in the day when Superman was known for punching out sentient universes that ticked him off. He could break down fortresses that sat comfortably at the center of the Big Bang, race to the edge of the multiverse in minutes, and produce enough energy to collapse dozens of timelines by going all out. But Darkseid was a challenge. Just to show you what I'm talking about, there was one story that centered around Darkseid waking up from his supposedly final defeat after nearly 1,000 years of laying dormant. Needless to say, his power had dipped off quite a bit during that time, so he made it his mission to recharge his batteries by stealing 3 of the most powerful weapons in the universe and draining them dry. Then when that didn't satisfy him, he straight up picked a fight with 2 different supervillains known for endangering entire timelines, stole all of their power, and still ultimately realized he was a lot weaker than back before the old 1,000-year nap. This overwhelming strength of his was in part drawn from a special cosmic force unique to Darkseid known as the Omega Effect. We'll talk about that later. But it was also partially due to him just being a new god. Jack Kirby made him tough, some of the toughest in the DC multiverse, and it was clearly no accident that a veteran of the field cooked up a group of characters capable of challenging even the strongest superheroes. But that's exactly where the problem started. Fast forward a few years to the company-wide event comic called Crisis on Infinite Earths. DC executives had grown tired with everybody being confused about which characters belonged where in their massive shared multiverse. Backstories were becoming convoluted, continuity errors were popping up everywhere, Superman had too many powers for any sane person to remember them all, and potential customers were starting to get intimidated. I mean, I can't even enjoy a good Batman comic without knowing how he's doing with Commissioner Gordon at the time. which requires reading that Dr. Fate crossover from several years ago, which can only be properly understood if I know about Batman's death to a suicidal wizard in Earth 2, and the established multiversal cosmology from Flash 123, Superman meets He-Man, or that time Hitler summoned Captain Marvel across the multiverse to help him defeat the British. DC needed a reboot. A big reboot across all their titles that would drop every last intellectual property into a single universe with one cohesive timeline, starting from the beginning. So in 1985, all the storylines they were running wrapped up a little early for readers to meet the diabolical Anti-Monitor. A new, multiverse-shattering menace bent upon the omnicidal destruction of absolutely everything. A threat so great that every hero and villain across all of DC's history would have to band together to save existence itself. And they did. Kind of. The crossover of a lifetime ended in a lot of deaths, a lot of changes, and an infinite number of universes being completely erased from the cosmos. Save for one. The universe that would come to be known as DC's single, definitive reality. But what does all this have to do with Darkseid? Well, remember earlier when I explained that Apocalypse and New Genesis exist outside of the traditional multiverse? By all accounts, they should have been completely unaffected by this massive reality-spanning crisis. In fact, later series like the Orion Solo Run and Darkseid War would paint the New Gods' involvement as something like passive observers to the whole thing. They could remember the multiverse and everything that happened in it, but they didn't do much to prevent its destruction, or to remind everybody that infinite universes once existed. In the minds of everyone else, there simply never was a multiverse. After the Anti-Monitor was defeated and reality shifted back to normal, the memories of those affected by the crisis just shifted with it. Only one universe had ever existed. Unless you were a new god who watched the whole thing go down from a safe distance. Really observant readers might even remember a short line of dialogue near the climax of the crisis that implied the new gods had somehow managed to cloak their extra-universal planets from the Anti-Monitor during his rampage. So you can call me Mike the TV, because company-wide reboot or not, no matter how you look at this problem, the new gods had no reason to be affected by the crisis. Which kind of makes this next part really weird. Superman fighting Darkseid post-85. Superman might have been hit hardest by the reboot, taking a colossal dive in power after the crisis changed reality. He went from toppling universes and timelines to toppling mountains? And while he would eventually start working his way back up the ladder, it doesn't make a lot of sense to see him fighting evenly with Darkseid so soon after a fall like that. Especially if this Darkseid was confirmed to be the same person who fought Superman's much stronger form. It gets weirder. Later DC events would bring back the multiverse, through alternate timelines, possible futures, new ways of manipulating space, etc. And sometimes, Darkseid would appear in those realities too. A different Darkseid, someone with completely separate thoughts, experiences, and even looks from the original. While every official DC statement continued to claim that only one Darkseid existed, and he sat outside the multiverse. Plenty of comics would reference this fact too, but sometimes Apocalypse and its dictators seem to just be out in deep space somewhere. These apparent contradictions weren't unique to him either. They also affected the rest of the New Gods just as chaotically. One day they would easily be able to craft entire universes in their hands, and the next they'd need to paint themselves yellow if they wanted to beat the Green Lantern Corps. In this story, Darkseid can survive a bomb meant to destroy existence itself without a scratch. And in this one, Doomsday nearly beats him to death with a few punches. These issues went on for about 23 years, and as far as I can tell, they were all completely unintentional. Some writers obviously didn't realize that Darkseid and his species weren't supposed to be rebooted like nearly everyone else was, as evidenced by DC's never-ending attempts to retcon the problem away. Oh, Darkseid was a lot weaker than he was supposed to be last comic? Maybe that's because he wasn't really Darkseid. It was one of his minions in disguise. Or maybe it was an avatar, a clone he created under his own power to do dirty work for him. The New Gods actually went through so many different rewrites and retcons that DC made fun of it themselves. Ouch. But see, none of these answers ever seem to quite solve all the problems. These two, for example, only focused on Darkseid and completely forgot that every other New God was suffering from the exact same plot hole. And okay, even if we assume that every New God sends out avatars to run errands for them while only existing in one form outside the multiverse, how do you explain stories where Apocalypse just straight up overthrows Darkseid? Or Darkseid's been dead for ages and there's a power vacuum? Or New Genesis is reduced to ashes? Are the planets using avatars too? And whatever happened to that divine prophecy that Jack Kirby talked about? Characters were always acting like the battle between Darkseid and Orion was fated to happen and neither of them could die until it finally occurred. How does that fit into all this? Why can Darkseid sometimes bend reality, control life and death, see into deleted timelines? Wouldn't those powers come in handy more often? The new gods were occasionally treated like necessary aspects of existence that could call meetings with other celestial forces, but they were also treated like ordinary aliens just as frequently. Which was it? What does it all mean? There were just too many questions. And even in the world of comic books, mysteries like this have an expiration date. They can only exist for so long and only become so convoluted before they attract the attention of someone willing to provide fans with all the pieces they need to finally finish the puzzle. Imaginary friends, this is Final Crisis. Our last stop on, honestly, a pretty complicated trip for understanding a single bad guy. Sure, there were a few detours along the way, but I think you'll find that every last one of them was necessary to uncover the full picture of exactly what's going on here. Because you see, a lot of stuff happens in Final Crisis. It was heralded both as a celebration of DC's contradictions and an attempt to sort of knit them all together so they make more sense. The new gods, of course, were the main focus of the whole event, especially Darkseid, and in my opinion, the lead writer Grant Morrison does an excellent job of clearing it all up for us. But it takes some focus, and a lot of digging. He's a crafty guy. Anyway, the story more or less opens up in the fallout of Darkseid finally obtaining the complete anti-life equation. We learn through dialogue that he used his newfound power to wage war against New Genesis, but the results ended up being more catastrophic than even he could have predicted. Nearly every single god died in the struggle. This ultimately led to our long-awaited cosmic showdown between Darkseid and Orion, but just as dear old dad was on the ropes, an unseen sniper ended the battle early out of nowhere by shooting Orion dead with a Radion bullet, toxic to the new gods. Orion's fading body fell to Earth, landing in Metropolis, and with the last real obstacle to his empire taken care of, Darkseid slowly but surely began his latest and greatest attempt at multiversal conquest. Yeah, heck of a way to start a finale, right? Well, full disclosure, the actual comic itself isn't near as linear as I probably just made it out to be. A lot of details don't get revealed until later in the narrative, and there was a pretty infamous amount of hassle with scheduling and communication among a lot of writers and higher-ups, so the tie-ins to this book don't always fit the final product quite right either. Exactly what counts as canon and where each event fits in the timeline is clear enough if you read, like, everything, but just understand that what you're hearing is a condensed version of the story. So the Justice League starts investigating exactly how Orion died and who managed to kill him, while prophets of Darkseid start preparing for his oncoming invasion by essentially building small armies and establishing underground brainwashing facilities. The first real sign that something has gone wrong is probably when a Darkseid worshipper actually manages to capture and kill the Martian Manhunter, a founding member of the Justice League. It was a really shocking scene for a lot of readers. The Manhunter was one of DC's most powerful and righteous heroes, killed off like a background character with a flaming spear through his chest and a crowd of smiling supervillains. And it didn't stop there either. Throughout the entire first half of this series, we basically see every one of DC's heavy hitters systematically taken off the table for Darkseid's unholy arrival. Batman is beaten and kidnapped by an agent of Apocalypse, Wonder Woman becomes patient zero for a deadly artificial virus, both Flashes get stuck in a race through time against death itself, one Green Lantern is nearly killed while another is put on trial for attempted murder, and even Superman is confined to the hospital when a group of villains bomb the Daily Planet, putting Lois Lane in critical. She was so bad that Superman was barely keeping her alive with a steady stream of infrared vision. But while the heroes were reeling from their sudden shift on the food chain, a lot of weird stuff was happening in the background too. We kept getting evidence that Darkseid and his minions were already invading Earth somehow, as if they'd jumped into the bodies of regular mortals and were parading them around like puppets. It's a strange idea for sure, but once Metropolis detective Dan Turpin starts claiming he can feel someone in his head, it becomes clear that there's more to the new gods than we've ever considered. Turns out that most of the major masterminds embarrassing the heroes are actually Darkseid's disciple gods resurrected from the war and possessing different characters. Grant Morrison explained in supplemental material that this was all Darkseid's doing, and early comics established that he could recreate his followers from memory alone. But they aren't really full incarnations of the new gods, more like aspects of Darkseid's will given form. Darkseid himself is the only new god actually trying to manifest on Earth, and he's doing it through Dan Turpin. He tried to do it through a mob boss, but he couldn't fully incarnate because the process requires corrupting a noble soul. And once Dan finally gives in, space itself cracks open. The sky starts raining blood, time crumbles around Darkseid's new body like a cheap sheet of tinfoil, and the entire multiverse starts spiraling toward oblivion in a massive singularity that is Darkseid. So what does all that mean? Well, believe it or not, it's not total nonsense. And it actually answers more questions than it raises, starting with the bullet that killed Orion. See, during the Justice League's investigation, they found the bullet not far from where Orion's body had landed. Which kind of makes sense. If you were shot in space, you'd just keep moving along the bullet's path until you either landed somewhere or were acted upon by another force, Newton's first law. But what doesn't make sense is that the bullet they found had been buried in the concrete for at least 50 years. Which basically means one of three things. Either one, somebody else fired a completely unrelated, hyper-advanced god-killing bullet in this exact same spot over 50 years ago. 2, Orion was killed 50 years ago. Or 3, the bullet had somehow traveled through time. Batman, having compiled extraordinary amounts of information on the new gods, as any good detective should, opted for option 3, posing that a god weapon could feasibly fire something in the future, launch its projectile backwards through the present, kill Orion a few days ago, and keep the bullet going for 50 years until it ran out of momentum. But that would require the new gods to exist in some greater form of reality than we do. They'd literally need a higher dimensional gun and a non-linear perception of time. But here's the big twist. He was right.
It's a magic bullet. Literally. An all-purpose god-killing projectile that can be loaded and fired over and over again from any gun ever invented. Essence of bullet. The new gods are incredibly powerful living ideas from a kind of platonic archetypal world. Now imagine a god bullet, fired backwards through time, to wind up embedded 50 years deep in the concrete's past.
We live in a very simple world. The first dimension is length, the second dimension is width, the third dimension is depth, and the fourth dimension is time. But that's when you realize that Darkseid has very specifically always existed beyond time. Beyond space. All the new gods have. Time deforms in their presence. Weeks smash into days. Space starts to collapse. Darkseid comes from a world beyond our simple 4 dimensions. A higher reality speculated to exist in theoretical physics through string theory and all of its variants. And in this story, Grant Morrison is finally acknowledging that. Treating the new gods like what they should be when taken to the logical conclusion.
From here where he no longer exists, Orion cannot see me. As all time becomes one time, the time has come to strike. Take aim!
The person who saved Darkseid in the battle against Orion was Darkseid himself. But the fight damaged him so severely that he fell onto the multiverse. That's why it's collapsing. The same way a 2-dimensional universe would collapse if you fell through a flat plane of existence. Every other time we've seen Darkseid, it's been a mere 3-dimensional fragment of his infinitely larger whole. Explaining the inconsistencies, the changes in power level, all the nonsensical abilities, how there can only be one of him when there appears to be infinite.
It was Orion's destiny to fall in final battle, splintered like light through a prism in an infinite number of deaths.
And on the way, he wounded you beyond repair, didn't he? A rotten carcass of a god, crawling into the sewer to die.
The truth is that the real, complete Darkseid, the one who lives beyond space and time, is bigger, heavier, and more powerful than the entire multiverse itself. So after he was bested in battle, before he was finished off for good, he positioned his fall to land on top of everything. One last spit in the face to the endless realities of heroes who would never let him have control. He wanted them to know that he could have destroyed them at any time. And he'd use the anti-life equation to finally rule existence for a brief moment, before collapsing it all into an endless pit at the center of creation, erasing absolutely everything below with his last breath. And this depiction is consistent with Grant Morrison's work, in case any of you were wondering. I'm not speculating here. He's made it very clear through a dozen interviews that Darkseid and the new gods all come from a higher dimension, and we've just been experiencing their projections into our reality. In fact, there are even hints to this all throughout Final Crisis. References to string theory, quantum mechanics, and higher dimensional concepts as Darkseid breaks through to the material world. It's an idea Grant likes to play with a lot in his comics. A recurring theme, if you will. In Morrisonian cosmology, existing in a higher dimension gives you godlike authority over the dimensions below. near omnipotence. You have more than volume, you have hypervolume. You have more than mass, you have hypermass. You are infinitely more powerful than the creatures in the dimensions below you because they exist relative to gods like drawings exist relative to humans. And DC's map of the multiverse reflects this too, explicitly placing Darkseid and the new gods several dimensional layers above our average comic book universe. They're like Lovecraftian Gestalt entities that transcend and intersect our reality at innumerable points. But all that being said, this still doesn't address everything. What exactly does it mean to be a new god? What kinds of abilities are afforded to these immense pan-dimensional deities, and how do they interact with our world? What about all those times our three-dimensional heroes actually traveled to Apokolips? Are these all the same place? What does it mean for the DC multiverse, and how can any of the Justice League even hope to defeat someone with transinfinite more power than all of existence combined? Yeah, you thought I was done talking about Darkseid? I haven't even started. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of exactly what he is, why he is, and how it completely changes everything you thought you knew about DC Comics. But by the time we're finished, I'll have successfully traced every last act of cruelty in the multiverse back to this single, twisted cosmic terror, and possibly an even greater threat lurking behind the scenes. But all that and more will have to wait. Until next time on the Imaginary Axis. The script was getting long enough as is, so I've decided I'm splitting it in half. That being said, part 2 will drop about 1 month from now, so I'll see you guys then. Thanks for being patient with me and sticking around to watch. I know I'm not as consistently active as a lot of other creators, but it's not because I don't want to be. And I try to make up for it when I can by really giving my A-game when it is time to release a video. So anyway, if you don't want to be left out by the time part 2 comes around, you really should hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so YouTube doesn't skip over you. Aside from that, I really appreciate the support as always, so just thanks for watching to the end. Tell your friends about me if you get the chance, and I'll see you next time. Have a fantastic day.